Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for checking out the stream. Welcome to the first ever SecuriTEA in Crumpets, where we'll host security professionals each month to talk about different security topics. Seeing as this is my first SecuriTEA, I'm going to be drinking a nice smoky Earl Grey from Fortnum & Mason. So if you're on the West Coast like I am, I hope you will join me this morning for a early morning caffeine intake. I hope everyone enjoys the next hour or so with myself and my first ever guest. So I've known my first guest for about just over 5 years, so I'm extremely excited to introduce you to him. Mathew Payne attended Cigital University in Dundee, where he completed his ethical hacking degree. During that time, he interned at Cigital, which is now Synopsys, where he was famous for fixing the ice machine in our London office due to the amount of ice that would always build up. And the name intern stuck around for a lot longer than it probably should have, even when he became quite senior. Mathew left Cigital in 2019, where he would work at Checkmarks, doing static analysis. And he recently, in August of 2020, joined Github as a field security architect. Welcome, Mathew. Welcome to the stream.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be the first guest here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you on, mate. So what we're going to do today, everyone, we're going to have just a quick background into Mathew and the types of things that he's done over the X amount of years. And then we're going to walk into CodeQL and do some nice demos around CodeQL. So Mathew, you went to Cigital, where you did a degree.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your time at Cigital?
Yeah, so for those maybe not familiar with Cigital, it's a university in Scotland, in Dundee. So it's a very relatively small city in Scotland, and they do an ethical hacking degree. Very good university where they do a lot of sometimes like degrees like the one I went to, where nobody did anything around ethical hacking to begin with. And what over the course of like those few years, I learned a lot about like getting started into security, a lot of development background as well. And then it got me my first internship, which you mentioned at Cigital, and then my career has gone on from there.
Nice. And what type of modules did you do at Cigital?
We did quite a lot of modules. One's focusing on mobile, on low-level hardware, and things like reverse engineering, and all those kinds of modules as well. Web testing, web development, you name it as well.
Nice. And which one was your most favorite out of those modules?
Oh, that is a very good question. For those who went to Cigital and were in my year, probably Chaos, which was our computer kind of, I can't remember the acronym, terrible with acronyms, but it was our, like, from computer science from the ground up, so looking at computer logic gates and things like this, and it was absolutely fantastic.
Nice. Sorry. And I know, and many people who have been to Scotland and Cigital know about SecuriTEA. Can you give us a quick kind of dive into what is SecuriTEA?
Yeah, SecuriTEA is one of the largest student-run events for security in the world, but it started a few years, about the year before I joined Cigital, so maybe 2011, I think, was the first one. And I think this year would have been the 10th anniversary, but of course, COVID has restricted people to go to Scotland and present there. So it's a great event, lots of different speakers from lots of walks of life and from lots of other universities, but also university students also participate as well as speakers as well on every subject known to man, at least to my knowledge, and things like this as well. It's fantastic. I highly recommend for anybody to go there every year if possible.
Yeah, I mean, after moving to the US, it was a big shame that I could no longer attend easily Arbite, and every time I submitted paper, like a call for paper, I was never accepted after moving to the US. So it was a shame not to go, but I do know one of my colleagues, Ksenia, actually came from over from the US and talked, I think, about AngularJS at Arbite, which was cool. So
Yeah, fantastic.
There's a very like hot topic between people that are doing like have done degrees or haven't done degrees, and I kind of just want to get your opinion, because I'm sure some people who either are thinking about starting a degree or doing a degree in general. Would you recommend a degree to someone, and if you would or would you not? Dive into that first.
So I know a lot of people that never went to university and have fantastic careers in computer security and IT as well. I know a few years ago, Google, Apple, and a few other tech companies have stopped like having that as a requirement for essentially being able to like participate in those companies and like join those companies. And I completely agree. I don't think that you should be bound by a university, like you needing to go to university to get a career in IT security. Yeah, I did go to the university and did a course at Arbite, and for me, I think it was the right choice. It kind of makes sure that you have a structured way of learning a particular topic. Of course, university will never, like no degree on earth will prepare you for the exact things that you will face in real life. But of course, it really helps you to learn, I think, is the primary thing around how to learn how to like reverse engineer, because when we did reverse engineering, it was very simple applications, not very real world applications, but really like great to start getting that base knowledge, which then you can go, hey, this is a subject I really care about, and go from there. But I do agree with like you don't need a university degree. It's sometimes harder to get indoors with a lot of traditional companies, but I think that's slowly going away as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that mentality. So when I did my degree at Leeds Metropolitan, now Leeds Beckett University, you got exposed to many different types of subjects, which normally you wouldn't really like actively do unless you were someone who was super motivated to go and learn about a topic. So you start learning about how to like write snort rules, or how to like look at actual hardware, and like even do like Cisco type modules. And as someone who has like an AppSec background who hardly ever touches like that in general, I don't think I would have ever actually like kind of done a lot of that stuff, because I primarily live at layer 7. I live in the web browser, and that is where most of my kind of experience comes from. So that's why I liked university. But yeah, I do agree, like when I joined Cigital back in 2015, I could definitely understand that we're at a point where you definitely don't really need a degree, but it definitely does expose you to a few things. So I think it's always that hot topic, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I would say a great starting for somebody who doesn't want to go and do a degree would definitely be to start self-teaching and going to conferences. I know that's very hard to say during COVID times right now, but I would say that once you start getting in the door and talking to smart people at these events, they might suggest like, hey, you should go and learn AWS, the cloud's the way forward, where everybody's heading towards. Go and learn that, and you might find out something that you may go, oh, actually the industry is telling me that, hey, we should go this way versus another way. I'm not saying you should do exactly that, but you can do whatever you want, right? So yeah.
And sometimes it's kind of a bit hard to actually get started in anything, because most of the time, like if you start looking at AWS, for example, it's going to be so overwhelmed. But if you like follow like a structured kind of course, which wouldn't have to necessarily be a degree, there are some real, like I think there's Cloud Guru or something like that, like lots of online resources that you can use to actually like look at like these. Well, so I just wanted to like have that like your interpretation of a degree, which I think we have a very similar mentality around these things. It has good aspects, but in reality, it's not really needed. But you definitely should do it if you don't really have, like, someone who has no kind of structure or doesn't really know where they want to go. I think maybe in America it's a lot more expensive. In the UK, after you've done a degree in the UK, you still have debt, but debt is not going to be as significant. So
exactly.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's move on to someone in the chat said, Unhip Coder says, some of the best coders Geek Masher knows doesn't have a degree. So I'm not entirely sure who that is.
That is very true.
But
I know who that is.
Oh, there you go. So we have some people who are also in the chat thinking that you don't need a degree to be a good coder. In reality, you don't need to have any type of formal background to be good at those things, as long as you have the passion, the time, and the investment. So at Cigital, and we'll go into consulting in a little while, but I've known you for quite a while now, and every time I've looked over your shoulder, you're writing code for something, and it's normally around you're trying to automate something to ultimately get the some type of process quicker and in a more optimized fashion. So you've done this for security related projects and also non-security related projects. What would you say your drive behind automation is and doing these types of projects?
That's a good question. I think most of the time it's around wanting to make things quicker for myself. I'm a big fan of automation to solve problems more quickly and more repetitively as well, because I believe that I shouldn't spend, for example, hours at a time or even minutes at a time doing a particular task that can be easily automated. Now, I say that, but there are things that are very hard to automate, but where I try to do is make the boring stuff as automatable as possible. Sorry. There's a great book. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's automating the boring things with Python. These kinds of mentality, I think, is fantastic. I think as well, one of the things you mentioned about the university stuff, one of the things that I do feel passionately about is that most all security people need to have some form of developer knowledge. Maybe not an expert programmer can write super optimized C code, but I think you as a security person should have a degree of understanding, not just some scripting, but maybe some more in depth about specific languages and things like this. But that's just my opinion and take on that. But yeah, I'm a big fan of automating the boring stuff in life, even that if that is a little bit of my job, just to make it a bit more efficient, so I can spend my time doing other things that are more valuable.
And what types of things have you automated to make your life a little bit?
Well, that's the thing. It really depends. I did a lot of stuff around automating, to a degree, this source code reviews side of things. We'll talk a little bit about that because, as you mentioned, I joined GitHub, and I also joined the team looking into helping people scan their code using static code analysis, which we'll talk about later. But this is a key thing about automating the boring stuff and making sure that you find these security issues in that source code. Now, this could be with open source tools. This could be with some commercial tools. But I feel that it really helps to automate all this stuff, because at the end of the day, now that development is not, you're developing something and shipping at the end of the month something, you're developing something every it can be 15 minutes and deploying that new feature to your customers as soon as possible, right? So that's where my automation also stems from as well. Things from the pen testing side, used to automate a lot of stuff around scanning for security issues, so that I know, okay, I'm going to stop looking for this particular security issue. I'm going to start looking at the more nitty-gritty security issues that either these tools don't find, or if I do find them, maybe you want to automate it and create an open source tool for detecting that security issue as well. That's the kind of stuff that I typically automate. And then maybe a nice Slack bot here and there, or a Discord bot, or whatever tickles your fancy as well.
Nice. And I do remember you started can't talk about clients here, but I know that you also worked on building a kind of automated kind of reporting system too, for one of clients when you were at Cigital, and that was like truly like a chef's kiss in like thing, because writing reports etc. was a very difficult time, especially for like high volume types of testing, which definitely can be time consuming, and when you have to write the report,
Yeah.
it's not so ideal.
Yeah, as I said, automation is nothing to do with security in particular. It's more around just making things easier. One of, as you mentioned, that specific customer at the time, they were they had a lot of reports, and like as you'll probably ask all of your pen testing friends, the thing that they hate the most is the report writing. Thankfully, I don't have to really do that anymore. But I remember it being quite a bit of a pain point for most people. And I think it's really important to see if you can automate. You can't automate it all. You don't. Sometimes it doesn't give you that kind of human touch and human feel, but at least it can give you a nice baseline for like report generating that you can then go ahead and modify a little bit more as well. So there's so much you can do with automation, and these large tech companies have proven that as well.
Got it. So let's just move on to consulting now. So you, in 2015, you interned at Cigital, now Synopsys, and you went back and finished your degree, and then you came back and worked time until you left for Checkmarks. So let's just talk about consulting in general. I know Toasted needs some tea in the chat, so you should definitely get some. Yes. So yeah, one of the first projects I remember you worked on when you were on your internship was basically manipulating TLS certificates to see how browsers would pass them and different third-party services. Can you talk about any interesting components to that and the types of things you may have found? If you remember, this was in 2015. I know it was 5 years ago. So, so yeah.
Yeah, this was an interesting subject that one of our principal consultants at the time, Paco Hope, who now works at AWS, wanted to do for a while. But of course, at that level, you have very little time to do these things. So one of the interesting things is there was a catalog of security issues that were coming out of problems with TLS certificates that a few of our colleagues identified and discovered some real critical vulnerabilities in there as well. So we had a few test cases that we wanted to automate the ability to automatically sign certificates or create certificate chains that were maybe invalid, and do these kinds of manipulations. And in some cases, this turned out to be really interesting bugs. As well, one of the things that we did, which was really interesting, we had to write some C code, because no other like if you try to, for example, modify certain values in Java or in Python, there's some checks before you actually create these certificates that we wanted to get bypassed, right? So, like for example, what happens when a certificate has a name that's longer than 255 characters long? Maybe some parsers of that AS1 certificate doesn't actually properly parse it, and things like this. So we found a few interesting bugs. There was a bug I reported to Mozilla about when you manipulated the version number of the certificate, because there's version 1 and version 3. But if you modified that to version 4, which isn't actually a thing, it might be now, but I haven't checked in years and years. There was a rendering issue. Thankfully, it wasn't a security bypass or anything like this, but it was a rendering issue where you can actually like make Firefox not even render you the certificate. So maybe if you're connecting to a certificate that you don't know, you maybe as a paranoid person, you may go and check the certificate and you wouldn't be able to see any of the content being rendered. So that was one of the most interesting bugs. And then there was some interesting other things, but I never got to really dive deep into some of these other services and things as well, and clients.
Yeah, at least, I mean, like, the fact that you still remember all of that after 5 years shows that you spent a long time on it. So what were the...
Having to learn C on the go, because that was the only language I could get deep enough into the was it OpenSSL library to generate the certificates. I remember that with a great detail.
Yeah, could imagine. Yeah, I haven't written much C myself, so I could imagine it being quite a strenuous process. So what were the kind of projects that you worked on when you were at Cigital and Synopsys?
Primarily was pen testing, and this was an interesting topic for me. But I think the thing I think of most pen testers kind of get the impression of, and I won't speak for everyone, but a lot of the time, pen testing is one of these careers where it's always trying to be the better pen tester, which is fantastic. But it kind of sometimes leads into a bit of culture around like who's the best pen tester. Oh, I found this security vulnerability that you maybe wouldn't have, or and like this is not just a synopsis by any means. This is more of a like bigger bigger picture kind of aspect of things. But this was one of the things that I was like, hey, this is maybe not the right thing for me, and things like this. Thankfully, I had people like yourself who were fantastic and willing to help anybody with any problems, like learn about particular topics. And I'm forever grateful for that. But yeah, primarily pen testing. Did a lot of other things as well. Did some network security. Did some threat modeling and security architecture review stuff as well. But one of the things that I started falling more in line with what my passion was code review, and also more of the automation around like the DevSecOps mentality of integrating tools into your pipelines that developers can consume results for, that provide value to the developers of like, hey, before I push this into production, I want to validate that this tool hasn't identified any potentially low-hanging fruit or maybe some more complex bugs before we push into production. And that's where my passion led me to move jobs from Synopsys.
Got it. And then you worked at Checkmarx for a while. Were you primarily helping clients with their solutions, or?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So for everybody who's not familiar with Checkmarx, they're a static code analysis company. That's their main product. They also have other products as well, but I moved to there to align myself better with the with a SaaS tool. But as you said, I only worked there for about a year, and then thankfully I got reached out by GitHub to join their team and work on things like helping customers integrate CodeQL and things into their CI/CD solutions and things like this.
Nice. So it's probably a good time to shift over to let's talk about GitHub for a little bit. And first of all, before we start talking about that, can you tell the chat what's behind you? Because I can see a croissant there, and I'm intrigued. It's making me more hungry than I was earlier. So
yeah, I have a few little trinkets that I've gathered over the few years, especially the croissant. I think that's hilarious on customer calls, and they see the croissant. Nobody's really asked about it, but one day they will. They typically ask more about a massive jug of water that I have next to my desk that I sip out every so often. But yeah.
Nice. And then, so you moved to GitHub in August 2020. What have you been mainly like focusing on since time at GitHub?
Primarily to help customers use GitHub Advanced Security, which is GitHub's tool and platform to essentially adopt security in a like developer-focused driven way. Of course, everybody knows GitHub is the home of open source, so it kind of fit very, very well into what they wanted. And I essentially joined the team as a field security architect to help those customers achieve the same goals as what we are passionate about as well. Yeah, and the tool primarily that we use is CodeQL, which is the subject of this live stream, and we'll jump into it a bit as well.
Yeah. Okay, so can you just so people in the chat may not know what static analysis is before we talk about CodeQL? Like before we jump into CodeQL, what is static code analysis to begin with?
Yeah, so static code analysis is primarily a tool that analyzes your code base, or actually compiles it, depending on the language and depending on the tool, to essentially automatically find results using taint analysis and other means to discover security issues in your code base. So this could be things from, for example, I think the best one would be something like SQL injection. What are the symptoms and what are the things that create something like SQL injection? You have something like a user input. So this might be your parameter, your post body, your headers, whatever it may be, and you want to trace that specific object in your code base to eventually find out where it leads to. Along the way, this data can be manipulated. Like there's so many different variants of how this could be done. There could be some manipulation, there could be some encoding or escaping, there could be all sorts of things. But the critical key is to find out things like where that source of input gets, for example, concatenated into a string. And it's like, okay, what does this string do? Oh, okay, this string then leads us to the point where it's being executed by your Java Hibernate framework or your Python module that does SQLite queries or anything like this. And what static code analysis tool does this statically without having to run the application. I think that's the key difference between static and dynamic. So dynamic would be your automated tools to do your pen testing and things like this for you, or even things like dynamic testing at runtime and process hooking and all these kinds of things as well. But you want to primarily look at the source code. This is typically a lot quicker and you can do it. So for example, there's things that are really hard and take a long time when it comes to dynamic analysis. I've worked on business applications in my pen testing days where you could have one post request with 100 different values that get pushed into this one endpoint, right? And they might have hundreds of these endpoints. And it suddenly gets a ridiculous point of having to test either, hopefully, a lot of that automatically, but also manually a lot of those endpoints and like variables that you're passing in like testing all of those with all the different payloads. Where if you do it something from a static code analysis perspective, you would be able to identify every source of input. So it might be even just where you get the body in your source code, or this could be getting your parameters or your post parameters that you're passing in as well. And then discovering where they go to, I think, is the key for a lot of this. Now, there are limitations of static code analysis. A lot of them are maybe not, a lot of tools are not context aware. So maybe there's a specific use case or something that the code doesn't know about, or it doesn't understand what this function does. So for example, maybe if you have your own custom escaping method or your custom sanitizer or your custom, I don't know, I'll check against a whitelist to see only that these values can be only these 4 things. But of course, sometimes a lot of static code analysis tools don't understand what that is. And that's kind of like the core behind code analysis, is where it's also a lot quicker typically than things like dynamic analysis. But it's a side of a coin. Like a lot of people advocate that static code analysis is the only thing and should be the only thing. I disagree with that. I think it's a combination of lots of different things to go into securing applications. Doesn't matter what type of applications they are.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So obviously, tools are only as good as what they can actually audit as well. So, for example, you might have a new framework that comes out, and if the tool isn't, modeled in that particular way, it's basically impossible for the tool to find any vulnerabilities. And the same for, in a dynamic sense, there are obviously going to be implementation bugs that actually are either happening because of, live systems, or, it may be like an Nginx configuration that could be wrong, and like those types of things generally won't be found by just looking at the application source code. So there are tons of I completely agree that static analysis, while it is good, it has its limitations, and it should never really be the only thing that an organization should do.
Yeah, no, I completely, because exactly that. Like you could discover openness, like the Heartbleed OpenSSL issue a few years ago with static analysis if you knew and wrote the tool to know about it. But of course, that may be deployed in your Nginx instance, not on your source code. So you might be scanning on your source code, say, hey, it's all great, but actually your deployment is completely broken. Yeah, completely agree.
So now, obviously we're trying, this is meant to be a vendor neutral stream. So obviously, whilst Mathew or Geek Masher does work at GitHub. We're treating this stream as vendor neutral, so we're not doing any sales pitches here. This entire next aspect is meant to be just getting people introduced to CodeQL because you can use it in an open source manner. So let's jump in now to what is CodeQL. So just give like the high level rundown of what CodeQL is, and then we'll start like diving into how to get started with CodeQL.
Yeah. Sure thing. So CodeQL is a static code analysis tool that was initially created by a company called Semel, who, if you read Hacker News about last year, not last year, but 2 years ago now, in 2019 in November, GitHub acquired them, and that engine is what is going to be we're going to be talking about today. What's really nice about both Semel and now GitHub is they have a passion for open source, right? So one of the things, the reason why I'm talking to you today is because you can use this as a security researcher if you want to maybe discover some issues in your open source libraries. You can use this to create new queries and just like look at specific code pieces that you're very interested in as well. There's so many things you can do with it. And also one of the beautiful things that GitHub has done is as long as you've got an open source public repository, and you're a developer or you're a security researcher, you can scan all this for free, essentially. So there's no commercial costs when it comes to that. Yeah, so it's a static code analysis tool. It has there has specific components that are very interesting, primarily the query language, which we'll kind of drop into a little bit in a moment, which is the way that you can write rules similar to something like a kind of like a SQL query, but with a flair of object oriented, which sometimes throws a little bit off people. But if you can imagine CodeQL, what it as an overarching how it works is it actually generates a what's called a CodeQL database, and this is essentially can be queryable, and you can write queries to run any sorts of different types of analysis against code bases that you've analyzed. So we're going to go across and like have a little look at what we can do with like an open source vulnerable by design application, and we can play around with that and see what we can do as well.
Sounds good. So before we get started on there, you wrote before you joined GitHub, you wrote a CodeQL introduction piece on your blog. Is that correct? Or
yeah, so we'll be covering a bit of what I did then. So before I joined, between the two jobs, I decided to learn a bit more of the CodeQL before I joined. So I did a kind of like introduction, and like from what I could understand, I think everything in there is completely valid. Still, now I have a more in-depth knowledge of it. The only things that I maybe have to go and do is that GitHub have changed some of the links in there, but they should redirect correctly. But I might have to go and double check that later on today or next week or whenever I get time to go around and look at it. But yeah, so primarily we're going to be looking at replicating this live, and people of course can come and join us as well if you want to do this live, or if you're watching this later on, I was going to say on repeat, but on YouTube or wherever this ends up. You can follow this guide to kind of start analyzing your open source projects.
Sounds good. Do we want to jump over now to show some demos?
Yeah, please do.
All right, let's just
let me know when you can see the screen.
All right, so I should now be seeing Mathew's screen. Let us know in the chat if you cannot see, but we're going to be zooming in a little bit, so everyone should be able to see.
Yeah, I'm checking the live stream. I can see my screen, so perfect. So this is going to be just a little bit of introduction of how to use the CodeQL CLI, which Lewis will share in the chat in a moment. But you can use the CLI to generate these databases, or you can use LGTM, which we'll go on to towards the end of this discussion, to kind of obtain these databases and run queries against them. So let me take an example here. So one of my No problem at all. Okay, awesome.
Okay, so yeah, we are now good. Off you go, Matthew.
Okay, so one of the things that I built for an open source project, which is called, I call it Security Queries. This is actually based off of a project created by a few of my colleagues in the US and the UK, where I've been able to create a GitHub repository that contains essentially my custom queries and the CodeQL query suites. So one of the things I kind of mentioned is there are components of this that are open source. So for example, all the queries that we'll kind of look into in a minute are actually all open source. So you can go ahead and, for example, I'll just take you to the main branch because I'm a little bit out of sync now, is you can actually go and find these queries and find a specific one that you're interested in and maybe run it against a particular source code, or maybe you see that, oh, there isn't a particular framework or something that I've seen in the past. I want to potentially have a little look in it. You can use this repository to investigate a little bit further into your particular languages as well.
So this is on
the reason
this is on the GitHub. Can you zoom in a little bit? So this is on the actual CodeQL GitHub repository, right?
Yes. So this is all open source, and anybody can download and use this. The CLI, which we'll share in a bit, is also, I think it's CodeQL CLI binaries, I think is it, and we'll post it in the chat in a minute. This is what we'll be doing to create a particular database, and then from there we'll run these queries on it. So this particular repository only contains the queries that we can use. Now, if we take a look into, like, for example, we're going to be looking at some of the JavaScript stuff. One of the really nice things, as you can see, is, for example, the different security rules that are in here. So you can take an example of, I think this is XSS, and you can have a look at exactly how it's written, how it's done, and you can run this on a particular code base as well. So that's kind of what we'll be doing today as well. And as well, one of the things that you can do is write your own queries. So if you're experiencing a particular issue that maybe no SaaS tool is discovering, that you've had maybe like a particular issue around, you can actually write a specific query. And you can also open source it, create a pull request. You can see as well, like, we're really passionate about like making this an open source project where developers from all around the world have contributed back to this as well. But the thing that I've created is a small repository with my custom configurations and my queries that I've written. There's a few things in here that you can specifically clone this repository, by the way, feel free to. It doesn't have massive amounts of queries in here, but like I will slowly be adding them and hopefully getting them added to the open source repository so that by default you can run these queries as well. And this essentially, when you load it up in VS Code, generates you something like this. What we can do from here as well is, once you've got the CLI installed, I'm not going to go ahead and show you how to install the CLI, but it's very, very simple. Download and extract I think it's a tar file or a zip file, and then from there we'll generate a database. So this database essentially contains like all the stuff you need to perform your queries on. I've got a folder here called databases. I just like to keep it all a bit organized. And I cloned a couple of repositories that are open source. One is JuShop. So if anybody's familiar with JuShop, you've probably heard of this vulnerable, I think it's a mean stack, right, Lewis?
Yeah, that's correct. MongoDB, Angular 2 and above, and
yeah, Express as well. So like this is what we'll be analyzing. If we have any problems, we can use Pixie, which is, so I believe they're both OWASP projects that you can go and clone from GitHub itself. Pixie is also a mean stack, but it's a slightly little smaller project, so typically it's faster to analyze and run results against as well. That's from the DevSlop team over at OWASP as well. So one of the things that I did prior to the stream, just to make it a little bit simple for myself, but we'll walk through this manually as well, is a kind of script to help me automatically create the database for these things. But I won't use this directly because it adds some variables and stuff. But one of the key things that this kind of shows you is that you can, for example, use the CodeQL CLI to do whatever you want, right? So there's a lot of, so I'm just double checking the version, but there's a lot of different arguments and things you can do with the CodeQL CLI. This CLI allows you to do things like creating and analyzing databases. This allows you to run specific queries on a database and a few other more deeper things that you want to run. We also have the ability to run unit tests as well on your query language as well. So what we're going to be doing is be creating a database for this project. So what I'm going to be doing is running CodeQL database, a few inputs, and I'm going to just cheat a little and show you up here what this looks like, but we'll walk through it together. This we want to create a new database, and we want to call it whatever we want to call it a specific path. So this one's going to be called databases, which will point you to my database folder over here. I'm going to call it a specific name. So here I'm going to call it juice shop, right? And from here, we define a few other variables. So it'd be things like language is JavaScript. But if you can imagine you having a C# application and also a JavaScript application, they do have to be analyzed separately. So it creates independent, language independent databases with different schemas and things like this under the hood. And from here, one thing that we do have to add is this search path. I had a problem with this yesterday. And what I'm just going to do is this search path essentially tells CodeQL where my base queries are. So if you think of it like when you're compiling a C application, you need to point it to the DLLs and stuff that you're using to use that library. Or it's similar to I'm not sure how for example, Python, you need to point it to where the libraries are stored that you want to be using, etc.
Sorry to interrupt, Mathew.
So
you have a line error on the search path.
Oh yes, thank you very much for that. And once we've got that search path enabled, we can point it to the source code. What is wrong with my keyboard today? Source.
I mean, you're live coding, dude.
Very true. Source roots. And this we will point to our source code. So I've got it in databases. That would be nicer if there we go. Databases / source. Is it sources? Yes, it's sources / let's go with juice shop. If we have some errors, we'll fix that in a moment. So what this does is looks through every single file and analyze it. This can be TypeScript or JavaScript, and it will generate this database folder for you, which essentially is a database itself. You can essentially run your queries on, which we'll do in a second. What I'll hopefully do is open source this script as well, so you can kind of get a gist of how it would be done. But you can imagine this is analyzing all of the files, making sure that they're interlinked, how they're calling from one file to another. So in a sense, what we were talking about how static code analysis does its stuff, is also that when it parses each file, like for example, how when you run Node.js, it interprets all the files and then runs it in its interpreter and things like this. It's a similar business, but instead of creating something that's executable or runs, you actually create, typically for a lot of static code analysis tools, this is in-memory objects. But for CodeQL, we actually create this database. Now,
quick question, Mathew. We have one question in the chat. Does this database need to be created on each new code change to the source?
Great question. So yes, it does. So if you can imagine, this database, when you create it, is a snapshot in time of what that database, of all that source code is inside that database. So if you can imagine, it's very difficult to if you're looking for more something like a reanalysis where you can then update that database, currently this isn't possible. But as you saw, I can't remember how large JuiceShop is, but it's quite a large application, and it scanned it in. I can't remember the command to look at the last execution time, but it takes a matter of seconds for even large projects as well. Of course, it'll take a bit longer than traditional things like linters, which under the hood are practically static code analysis tools in their own right. And from here, it creates a database. Now, we're not going to go over too much of this, what's in here, but you have a snapshot of the source code, the logs of how it was done. So like similar to what we saw in the command line, and then the database itself that contains all the content and the schema and things like this. I'm not going to go too much into the database schema or anything like this. Now we have this database file. We might have to run a specific update command. Now this is just, I was going to copy this, but it's slightly different. But sometimes you need to update the database, and to finalize it, this just kind of says to the database, okay, this is the final snapshot of the database. Now I'm not going to. It probably wouldn't need this, but I'm going to just add this because sometimes it has locking issues and things like this that I've experienced in the past. We're going to call it JuiceShop. We'll also add search path as well, equal to, and I'm just going to copy this as well. And this creates and updates this database. Now, this is just seconds. This just makes sure that everything's well. From here, this is where the interesting part comes. Now, I've opened Visual Studio Code because we can do this two ways. One is we can call essentially the database analyze command. This essentially allows you to give it like specific requirements, like the RAM, the threads, the rerun, if you want to use the cache versions of these queries, the format of what you want to export. There's a few different formats, but Serif is the standard format that CodeQL uses. I always forget the acronym itself, but it's Static Application Reference Formats, I believe is the acronym. And this is essentially a schema for a JSON object. So specifically creating a JSON object with a specific schema of it. And this contains all the details you need for a static code analysis tool to essentially operate. And you got other things I won't cover too much, but like where you want to put the output of that Serif or CSV or whatever file, and then also the search path as well. So the search path most of the time works without having to update it, but sometimes if you have a search path in a different place than what it would be expecting, you have to set this as well. And then you point to the CodeQL database and you run. I've got here the CodeQL suite, but let me just run the, why is that not? Oh, okay. But let me just run the help commands and I can show you what this last parameter does. This is the interesting one. This allows you to point to, a specific query, directory, or query suite that you want to execute onto this database. Now, what is a query suite? A query suite essentially is a collection of queries that are executed on top of the database. So if you can imagine, instead of running one query to look for cross-site scripting, and then you having to run a next query that runs against, like, you're finding your SQL injection, the next one for path traversal, you can essentially bundle this all together in what we call a query suite that essentially you can define to say, I want every query in this folder that has a particular value, like a really high precision or other metadata that you want to base this off of. So what we're going to do is I've got this query suite as like an argument inside this command. And what I'm actually going to be doing is be pointing it to a directory. So this did show you as well, you can run this against a directory. The directory itself contains my personal queries. So if you open up this project, and as I kind of showed you on the browser, if you open this one up, we're not going to the CodeQL one, you can see that I've actually created a few other queries that I've experienced in the last in the last few months that I think, hey, this would be an interesting one to add into the open source project. I want to work on these kinds of projects, etc. So what you do is once you open Visual Studio Code, you can either go in here and select a query. I think this is one I wrote to kind of like make it a little bit easier for people to understand what's happening. So some of you might see that it's quite similar in a sense of how it looks to a SQL query, except for maybe the ordering looks a little strange. There's no cap, like you don't technically need caps for a lot of SQL languages, but there's some interesting stuff that you can see here. A lot of the things behind the hood are all the libraries that are provided by the security team at GitHub and SEML. So, for example, I don't want to, every time I write a query, have to care about the data flows between my application. Like, for example, we were talking earlier about how static code analysis works. I don't want to have to rewrite how to find this sink and head to this source. So the team have done a lot of this for us. So what I've done is like an example here is like, I want to find essentially a call expression, which you can imagine is when you invoke a specific call. And the from is kind of like where you declare your values as such, like your variables and things like this. Or like and the where statement is the awesome bit. So this is a very simple query where you're looking for the name of the callee, which is essentially the name of the method called insert. And I want to make sure that it is it's invoked as well. Now, the reason I created this query was because, and I open, let me copy this just to make sure. Is because actually something interesting I found a few weeks ago was actually this particular insert is actually a deprecated method that has been tagged as part of their API that they're going to be removing, or they've already removed, or et cetera, et cetera. So I was kind of interested, like, hey, maybe it's an interesting query to like find out, hey, across my organization, who is like maybe not using like this specific query, or maybe you want to say like maybe it's an interesting thing to run on your open source projects and go, hey, we should be migrating from this insert to insert one or insert many. Now, there is a few issues with this, so I've made this as simple as possible. But you can imagine, like, hey, Matthew, the good question here is, but from my understanding of how this query runs, I will find all methods called insert. I have an insert for a method that is a list object, and I want to insert into an index an arbitrary object into my array. So this is not the best method of discovering this. And this is where things like CodeQL, you can actually write these queries to do exact specific requirements that you need. Now, speaking of this, what you can do, and I was gonna copy that command, but actually what I'm gonna do is take this query. So I'm gonna just copy the relative path, copy the full path just to make sure everything works. I'm gonna paste it in here so you can see my deprecated methods. And when I am going to comment out this. And what I'm going to do is run this command. Now, this just gives me a little bit more RAM, a little bit more threads by default. And this rerun, I think, is quite interesting, is CodeQL actually compiles these queries into compilable, cacheable objects that essentially get loaded in that are pre-compiled, and this really helps with like optimizations and things like this. But sometimes you might have things where maybe the cache is slightly polluted with maybe something you don't want. Maybe you've run a specific library that's pre-compiled and cached, but now you've modified it and maybe the caching hasn't flushed it or anything like this. So you may want to just rerun this. And we're going to be pointing it to this file. So when we run this, I'm going to just run this because it's a little bit easier. There's nothing else complicated in this. I like showing like specific values like do shop for the language and things like this, just to make it a bit easier for myself. And when I run this, what happens now is it will have found and compiled this one specific language, this specific query. You can see like, okay, cache is found. So now it's compiled. Is there a compiled cached version of this query? Yes, there is. And then it will run it on this database that I currently have. Once you've essentially evaluated it, it produces this BKRS file, which I cannot remember the exact description of it, but it's essentially a results file. And from that results file, it will take that and essentially go, hey, I want to now interpret that into the results format that you wanted. In this case, we wanted a Serif file. Now, if I go into my database results, I will now have this juice queries file. For some reason, I'm getting this strange error, but one of the other things that you can do is install an extension for VS Code, which is called, I can't remember the exact name for it, but it should be something called Serif Viewer. It should be from the Microsoft team, Microsoft Dev Labs. And what this allows you to do is when you click on a Serif file, it opens this panel here. And this panel is where you get some really interesting things. So you can instantly go into this and see the exact issues that have been discovered inside each of your files inside your source code. So you can see here, inside our source code for JuiceShop, we've found now that this promise here, this review, so it might be somewhere else here. I can't see exactly, but this is it's being initialized as an empty array, blah, blah, blah. But the important thing here is it's found this insert method, right? And it's also found another insert method here. This is great, but Mathew, like, hey, like this is not very useful, right? Because insert by itself may not be vulnerable, may not have any specific security issue and things like this. But it gives you kind of an insight into, you could do this with a simple grep, but now we'll start looking into some more complicated things that we can do, right?
I have one quick question, Mathew, around the Serif file. Like most organizations that are on the GitHub marketplace ultimately also use the Serif output, right? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that GitHub has built is the ability to push, like we've essentially talked to our partners around and open source like tools and said, hey, we're going to support this Serif file. It's a very well-defined standard, open source standard of defining static code analysis results. Not even just static code analysis results, but like results from lots of different tools. And we can absorb that and display that to people. Now that's more of the commercial side, but you can. This is essentially what it does. So if you can imagine, I'll take an example from one of my open source projects. I thought I had it open, but I don't think I do. Is this Pixie project that I have? I've actually enabled this. I can't show you this tab because I'm not logged in right now on this PC, but like you can imagine that you'd be able to open, like I've added Anchor, like the free Anchor engine and a few other tools like ESLint, which do produce this Serif format that get published into GitHub, or you can also use this yourself to do whatever you need as well.
I mean, the reason why I mentioned that could be interesting is because you technically could automate from many sources of scanning, and then you could ultimately kind of parse all of those Serif files because they're the same type of format, and potentially then put it into one kind of like ideal location for actual scanning, which could be quite cool.
Yeah, so like, for example, we'll quickly look into this just to like give you an example of what this looks like. But you can see like here, the driver and the tools that are used here was CodeQL, the exact version of it. And the interesting thing that you may, as a security researcher, know what when I produce this Serif file, what rules are on it? Oh, in this case, the CodeQL team have created an ID called deprecated methods, which actually, if you notice in here, is actually defined as part of the standard query itself. So you could add metadata tags of whatever you want, and it'll appear in here. So you may want to say, like, for example, this tags element here has security and this CWE ID, which I added. But you could start, like, for example, adding in some stuff around external OWASP. This is not really a problem, not really an OWASP category, but let's say top 10-A1. It's not an injection issue, but you can imagine adding metadata to CodeQL to essentially populate this Serif file. Now, this is the same for other tools as well. If ESLint has its own specific, like, hey, we want to tag our specific like rule ID or our specific tags for security issues, they do, and they publish that as well. So it's really cool. And also the other things, as you mentioned, is things like locations. Now, this is where, not this one, but the results, sorry. This allows you to essentially look at exactly the location that was discovered of that security issue. So if you can imagine, if we're in a second, we'll run some more advanced queries, but you can imagine this like being multiple steps as well. And you didn't really see it when I loaded this in, but you'll see in a second the steps. So what we'll do is another thing that I mentioned as well was running a query suite as well. And this is where I think a lot of the stuff comes to. Now, as you can see here, I've actually got quite a few different queries that I've written, or like my colleagues have helped me write, and I've added them to this open source project. An example of this was a simple like regex pattern to find specific hard-coded SendGrid credentials. Another one was a more advanced one, which was allowed us to detect a particular double composition, like of a React
AngularJS.
Yeah, AngularJS.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was thinking of React for a second there.
I say frameworks wrong all the time. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. Which was fantastic. So if you run this against applications, you may find some interesting stuff in here. But you can see this is starting to get a bit more complicated. Now you're getting like different elements as well. You're getting more like framework specific things. Like I want to get like a service reference, so that I'm not an Angular expert. I'm more of a React expert. But this might be able to find, I'm assuming, React services, or maybe Lewis, you've got more of a insight into what that might refer to.
Yeah.
But you can imagine this start to build up. Sorry.
Yeah, like there are like things which are defined as services within inside AngularJS. So you can build a service, and then it will be looking for things that take in compile from, I don't know much about CodeQL, but normally when you have $compile, or there's like two other components, there's $compile, $eval, and a few other things. And like these things can take in, if they take in X elements, which are ultimately controlled via the user input, this can lead to XSS ultimately. So yeah,
exactly. So in this instance, it might be a service that is defined. You can see here it's like, hey, I want to get the name of it. It's compiled, so I want to do $compile is it. So anytime $compile is used in your application, this statement will equal true, and that specific element will be like, okay, this is now like one of the elements as part of this. So you may want to go, oh, it's great to identify all the compiles, but this isn't enough, right? You want to maybe go, and I want to get all of its compiled calls of compile. You maybe want to also search through and get like, hey, I want to make sure it's what's being passed in as the first element, and things like this as well. So and you can do, this is just a more complicated one, but you can kind of get the point. Now, once you've added in, like, for example, your own custom ones. So this is what I recommend is like, hey, have you seen a security bug that's interested to you? Like maybe go and like look up how to write CodeQL. Some of my colleagues have done some fantastic talks on how to write CodeQL queries. You can essentially go ahead and like listen to them. They're fantastic. It's where actually most of my knowledge comes from, and you can start building your own queries to maybe discover your own issues, or maybe your own CVEs that you've discovered. You may want to write a CodeQL query to find that specific thing.
Yeah, the interesting thing now, there is that, sorry, I just don't want to interrupt too much, but from what I've seen, that there is the bug bounties page on security as well. So, technically as a security researcher, you could go and find a bunch of vulnerabilities in open source libraries that have bug bounties, write your own queries, scan those like open source libraries, and then you ultimately can, once you feel like you've done enough and either made enough money or found enough vulnerabilities where you're happy, you can then go to the bounties page and then submit that to make money via actual GitHub, because they'll pay you for interesting and very high accuracy new like .ql files, basically. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, if you find something, like one of the things we're passionate about as well is like, this is all open source like as well. you have the ability to, I think like some of these even are up to like $5,000 can be granted to people as well to build new queries or find new interesting things that they want as well. There are some criteria, of course, as you can imagine, but yeah, you can definitely go ahead and write queries to like find specific issues and get paid to do those as well. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I do. So one of the things that I've done as well is I've created a folder called JavaScript, where I host all my files. I've got an example one from one of my colleagues that he wrote, and a few other ones in here. And what I can do as well is, you can see here, I compiled and run a single query. Now, if I modify this script, so it's the exact same as what we did before, but now I'll do one thing, and I will change this file to be 1, just so there's no overwrite for now. But I'm going to produce the exact same file, but the only difference is I'm going to swap it to this folder. So it's not the name JavaScript, it's actually the folder JavaScript. Maybe // would help more. But if I rerun this now, we run the same thing. What will happen is CodeQL will pick up that you're pointing it to a specific directory. And what it will do is it'll load those into the database and compile them first, and then run the evaluation of those compiled queries on that database. And what's the really nice thing is, once this runs, is that those evaluated queries will produce these BQRS, these result files, and then furthermore will create from there the Sarah file. So now if we run this, and I don't know why it does this, you can see that actually now, instead of having those original results, where if you look in here, the only rule that was run was this deprecated methods, now you can start seeing that you have rule 1, hard-coded credentials, SendGrid, rule 2, low dash template, rule 3, deprecated methods, which is the one we had before, and this AngularJS double compilation issue as well. So you can start doing this. Of course, this application doesn't have all these issues, but you can imagine, like, on different databases for different projects, you will find these specific issues as well. These queries are like, I've open sourced them, but they haven't been added to the GitHub's CodeQL open source repository yet, because I haven't done enough deep dive into like finding use cases where this could be not an issue and things like this. One of the ones that I can show you, which I'm going to probably be open sourcing in the next few weeks, that was really interesting for me, is like for Python, which I'm very passionate about writing in Python, is server-side template injection issues. And you can see now it gets a little bit more complicated, where you can define what's called a configuration. I'm not going to go into this too much. Go and look. We'll be sharing some of the videos that some of my colleagues did, which they're like the SMEs, the subject matter experts in this topic. But you can define a configuration where you can say, hey, where my sources of data come from, where my sinks of data come from. You want to see if from your source to your sink, you have any data flows. And you can also define what those data flows are. And in my case, if any of you are familiar with Flask, there's actually a render template string function that actually, if you have anything coming into the first argument of this function, it actually can get you arbitrary execution on your servers. So you really want to make sure that none of your like for example, in my case, none of my developers or none of anybody's developers for open source, for commercial, whoever ever runs this in a secure way, is this. It's kind of like an execute, but of course you're using a template. And I've created for example, some interesting use cases to see like if the tool picks them all up and things like this. So you can start getting really, really in depth with these queries. One of the really cool things that you can do as well is why I've got VS Code open. So you can actually, in my project that I showed you initially, this project, I've actually got submodules, Git submodules of the CodeQL and the CodeQL Go. So they're two different repositories. And I showed the CodeQL one earlier. What you can do is actually go in and also run a specific query yourself. And I kind of showed it in Chrome, but you can imagine going in and say, Let's not pick XSS, we'll pick SQL injection. I think this is a bit more interesting. And what you can do is that you can install the CodeQL plugin for VS Code. Now, that fantastic plugin, the team have done a really, really awesome job for this. This allows you to load in a database that's been pre-compiled and run your queries on top of it. So this is where we see most of our researchers doing this. So if we go to our database folder, we can right-click it here and say, hey, I want to set this to my current database. Click this in, you'll see some movement. If you're using a workspace, it will actually show up in your workspace. I don't care about this too much, but sometimes it's useful to see the source code and things inside what the source code itself is actually inside the database. So this is what it's showing you. And you'll see also in the CodeQL plugin now, you've got a database here that's called Juice Shop, right? And you've set it to the current. So you can imagine loading up as many as you want and running maybe a query on this one database, this database, etc. From here, what you can do is right-click any query that's in the CodeQL repository or your own personal ones and run it. So you can go ahead and go, hey, I want to run this query in here. What this will do is run natively inside VS Code your query. So I'm running one that was built by the CodeQL team, but you can do this from your own queries as well. This takes a little bit longer because, as you can imagine, the CodeQL team have written this more like a library. So you can see here, we're importing some specific modules for example, the SQL configurations and also the NoSQL configurations. So we bundle SQL and NoSQL together in JavaScript. That's not always the case for a lot of other languages. And then we have to compile those. So in the case of this, all those other queries that I wrote didn't use any of these sub-modules or pieces that need to be also executed. But you can imagine this library of frameworks and modules, this starts getting really extensive inside CodeQL. I think if you look in frameworks, there's lots of frameworks that are added support for that you could say, hey, instead of writing my own framework to find a particular Angular 2 object, I can just call Angular 2 dot get by name or whatever the API is for that specific library and go, hey, I want these Angular 2 objects. So it gives you a lot of power and flexibility with that. So it's not, that's why I always say it's a query language like SQL, but it's SQL++.
I have a quick question as well. Do you have any, is there any online documentation to see the API references?
Yes, so there is some on I think it's still under the SEML documentation, but there, I think it's moved to codeql.github.com. So this is the one that we recommend. You can have a look in this. It'll give you a bit more details into the CLI, the Visual Studio Code, and also how to write queries and the query guides. Now this contains, I think it's this one. You can start diving into it. There is a API reference somewhere, but I can't remember where it is. But you can imagine jumping into the JavaScript one and maybe looking at specific things that you can do, specific topics you want to do. There is a guide somewhere here.
Mm-hmm.
It's changed slightly since the last time I really looked deep into this, but you can imagine looking through this and finding exactly what you need as well.
That makes sense. Cool.
So what this will do is when you run the query, it will load it similar to the SARA file, and you'll be able to look into specific queries outputs. So in this instance, we run the SQL injection query. We found that actually, let me close this and we can open this a little bit more. You can see the data flow, right? So in this use case, we're actually getting this request body. So this ID here is being is coming from a body, from the request body of this Express app. I'm pretty sure it's Express.
Indeed.
Oh, it's a mean stack, so it is indeed. And you can see here, you can kind of see the data flow coming from the ID. So instead of the body itself is some tainted input, but you're also receiving the ID element from that there. And you can see it's highlighting the specific elements. And you'll see that it's assigning it to this new variable called ID. And what happens is this will be used inside this find once. This might lead to NoSQL injection in this case. And you can see all the different instances of this. None of them are, this is more interesting. So this is like a more traditional SQL injection where you might have some kind of template string that you're using. I can't remember what the syntax is called. Please remind me, Lewis, if you remember it. But when you're using the ticks, it's kind of like interpreted.
Could wish I actually you wish I would remember, right? Because I am, but no, it's template strings, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
what happens is this value from this request parameter is being passed into this template string and then being arbitrarily executed by this. And I think this is SQLized. I don't know what database it uses, but as you can imagine, GShop has just no SQL, but it has like SQL just to kind of give like that person who's like, because GShop is primarily used for students or people learning to like find security issues for pen testers typically, but it's a great source of like, hey, we've seen this, like I've seen something similar to this, and I'm sure you have, Lewis, in production at your customers. And this is a sad reality, but what is really cool is you can find this automatically using CodeQL as well.
Especially when you're looking at millions of lines of code as well. Like having something like this is absolutely amazing. And just because like most applications like maybe written in JavaScript today, or not most, but like there's a lot of production, high organizations use JavaScript today to write backend code. You will still find NoSQL injection. You will still find SQL injection, and it's not going away anytime soon. So yeah, this is definitely an amazing way to be able to find like not even low-hanging fruit. This is like quite high critical type issues.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Yeah, and like one of the other things that I really like as well is you might have seen. I call the CodeQL team call this paths. I like to call it instances because I think it's more relatable to pen testing and things like this, where you have a specific sink, like for example, this one, the sink itself is where it's doing the select statement with this criteria. But another interesting thing here is that you've got two paths. So you've got two instances. In this case, it looks quite similar, but there might be some. Maybe it's being this. Okay. So there's a slightly different flow path, and ultimately, if you fix it here, it will you'll resolve the issue itself. But you can imagine using this for any type of query. Now, one of the really interesting things you can do as well is I kind of mentioned the suites. I won't go into this too much, but you can imagine you could run a catalog of these vulnerabilities. So you kind of remember I said like running this on a particular directory. You can run all of the XSS ones, all of the whatever command injection ones, or you could write your own as well, and hopefully get paid by GitHub to write those as well. And one of the other things as well that's very interesting is that you can be done as well, and this was something I showed Lewis yesterday, was we have a now semi-legacy product, but we're still releasing updates for it, etc. Is called LGTM. Now this, I mentioned the word product there, but actually what happens is this is actually allows the open source community can go here and actually explore different databases that the team created. So you could imagine, for example, a great project to test, because this is quite a vulnerable application, at least the snapshots that were discovered a while ago. I think here it's got some really interesting, I believe it's Java and JavaScript. I think this application is built in. You can see up here Java, JavaScript, etc. You can go ahead and, for example, download this database and run your own queries against it. Maybe you want to find like, okay, this ActiveMQ client from like 10 years ago or whenever this was wrote initially, maybe you want to run a specific query that you've now written for Java and you want to run against it. And this is really nice because if I go back and so instead of going through what we just showed you in like, hey, we want to like analyze our open source project, you can actually go ahead and download and find one. So if you type in like GShop, it might be with a dash, I think is the repo, but you can actually go and download like the actual like current version of GShop, instead of running your own analysis, go and download that database and run your query against it. As you can see, there's 209 alerts for this project. I won't pick this one for the demo, but like if, for example, wait.
So while you're looking for a project, Mathew, I want to chime in here for a quick second. So I've used LGTM for a while, just kind of, like through like ever since it's been released in public, and I have definitely made some money through bug bounties by just building because you can log into LGTM, I believe, through GitHub, and you can basically build project lists. And what I did was I went through all of the bug bounty programs, and I don't do this anymore, so feel free to take a look, people listening. But you can log into LGTM, and obviously you can do it locally too. But you can log into LGTM, you can build project lists for like bug bounty programs that have active programs that have source code in scope, check to see if they are in LGTM, and then add them as a resource. And then you ultimately can scan them, or even just take a look at the automatic scan, because you're already going to get all of the predefined rules that are in the core of LGTM scanned against that project. And then like traverse them and review them, and then see if you actually are able to find any types of bugs. And that's actually a very interesting way to where you might make some extra cash just by actually reviewing the LGTM results, which have not been yet passed by someone else. I mean, it's very unlikely because obviously they are public and people are looking at them. But I definitely have, I have reported some vulnerabilities to private and also public programs that have these types of things.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, one of the things that I really like is you can actually use the query console. So this is essentially like kind of what I showed you in VS Code, where you could write up your queries and then execute them on a specific database. What you can do is, if you want a quick hey, I want to test this query out on some projects, I can go ahead and select for example, the Angular project. Its language is JavaScript, and I want to run a specific query on that database, and LGTM allows you to do that. So it's similar to what I've showed you in VS Code, but you can imagine this is just using LGTM. And they do a lot of the pre-compiling, a lot of the libraries and stuff, so you don't have to pre-compile them as I was doing every time. So it gives you maybe a bit quicker, and you can run it against a lot of different projects as well. So if you're looking for a specific I was going to grab maybe my insert query, but that might not work for Angular, but you get my point of doing that. But one of the other really cool things that I really like is the ability to if you pick Angular, for example, you can copy this URL and say, hey, actually, I want to download this URL. You might have to delete those alerts, but this may be not a good thing on my internet, but it will go ahead and download that database for you that's already been created by the CodeQL team as well. So if you wanted to have a specific look at a specific snapshot of a library, maybe you want to go to LGTM and download that as well. And it's free to download them and use it as well. My only recommendation is open source your query and get that sweet bug bounty money as well. But yeah, I probably was going to cancel that, but now I've added it. I don't think there's a cancel button.
All right.
But yeah, I don't know if there's not much more I wanted to cover in this session, but I'm always happy to come back and maybe dive a little bit deeper into maybe writing queries or whatever maybe people post you on Twitter in the next few weeks or months as well, and we can go over it and maybe an ad hoc session as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to stop. Obviously, we saw a lot today. I do appreciate your time, Mathew. And this was, I definitely, every time I've seen you go through this, I mean, I always learn a little bit more and kind of think about the types of things that I could leverage this on open source projects for. So with that, thank you, Mathew, for joining us today. This was the first episode of SecuriTEA and Crumpets. And we have one question from the here, which says, maybe an overview of using GitHub Actions, etc. to kick off. If it's supported, that is. But
yeah, so well, before I could show you quickly because it's very, very simple. But if you go, actually, I could just explain it. Actually, if you go into GitHub today and you have the security tab. Oh, let me actually, you're sharing your screen. Thank you.
Yep.
If you go into a specific project, I'm not logged in, but if you go into specific projects, no, that's not. So like I mentioned, I have this project called Pixie that I forked. If you have a security tab in here and it's an open source project, you can go in, there should be a code scanning element here. Go ahead, click on it. It will give you an option of like setting up an action. And it's almost as easy as clicking it, opening it up, and it will generate a file that looks similar to this, this one. And all you need to do is make sure that maybe for compiled languages, you may need to make sure that the build works successfully. But literally, this is all you need to do, and commit. And then you will just watch your actions, and then you should see it publish the results into the GitHub as well. And it's completely free for anybody to do that as well, for open source projects.
Very cool. And for JavaScript, you don't have to like. Do you still need to add like auto build for like JavaScript languages?
No, you don't need to. So that's just to make sure that, for example, by default they add the auto build, but if it's for non-compiled languages and Go, I believe you don't need the auto build. But it's always good to just add, because sometimes it does some sanity checks for you as well, and things like this.
Yeah, I think obviously the best thing to do this for this. The puppeteer is probably just take a look at already someone's workflow that has this configuration, and then just copy it, which is like similar to your language, and then run it, and then fix any of the errors that may happen when you run your action. And obviously, you know, I know with the free tier you do get free action, so anyone can really play with this for free to kind of get an idea of how this might work on like if you were a developer or if you were working on any type of thing, you could probably still leverage this, you know, for free on like locally.
Yeah, exactly. So like the session we've covered today was more of writing, like looking at the rules and things like this. But yeah, great advice. Look at some of the open source projects. Juice Shop have CodeQL enabled as well, so you can see how they do it. Like they have got something similar to my one. It's very simple, like, and to the point. If you're looking, maybe another great thing to maybe do is fork an open source repository, like let's say damn vulnerable web app written in Java, and go ahead through that process of setting it up. You may have to make sure that for actions, you have to use the right OpenJDK version to compile your application, and make sure you have the right build command, which is I think they use Maven, just mvm build, and there you go. That's all that needs to happen. But yeah, if we want to dive a little bit deeper into this, because this is just scratching the surface for this, we can do this another day.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to stop. But I do really appreciate your time, Mathew. This has been very informative, and I'm sure it hopefully has given some people a good idea of maybe what they might want to do with CodeQL. And obviously it's free, free to use. So, by all means, take it, try and leverage its power to try and either find some bugs in your own software. Obviously, you need a license if it's for commercial, but for open source projects, you can obviously run this for free. So again, Mathew, thank you very much.
My pleasure always, man.